It is almost 1 p.m. in Sydney. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia. I'm Paul Allen. Here are the top stories. Asian bonds slide after hotter than expected US inflation strengthens the case for the Fed delaying rate cuts. The gauge of global debt suffering its worst drop in 14 months. And it's completely the reverse picture in China. Consumer prices stalling there while factory gate deflation extends its slump, underscoring a key threat to the economic recovery. Plus, the US and Japan unveil plans for deeper security ties as President Biden hosts a state dinner for Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. OK, let's start off with a look at the markets, and there's plenty going on. Let's start with the data of the day. This is the number that moved everything. US CPI for March rising 0.4%. That topped estimates, and it topped estimates for a third month in a row. So as for the June rate cut, the consensus seems to be